was a semi-secret organization of the city's largest businesses and banks. And it barred unions for 30 years and made Minneapolis famous nationwide for its anti-unionism and for its low wages. There's been a magnificent book about that written by Bill Milligan. It's listed in the back of this book. And it's a heady book, but it's well worth taking a look at. On the Iron Range, the United States Steel, the country's largest industrial conglomerate, did roughly the same thing as the Citizens Alliance in Minneapolis. In the mines and lumber camps of northern Minnesota, there was what we today call blowback. The radical IWW, that's the Industrial Workers of the World, built a strong socialist communist movement among migrant and immigrant workers. The leaders in that movement were acknowledged to be the Finns. Most of them were blackballed and prevented from taking mining jobs in the mines. Be blacklisted, they in anger, spread out across the Great Lakes country, either taking what jobs were left in the lumber industry, lumber camps, or starting small farms in the stump-filled cutover, and building co-ops and socialist organizations and workers' colleges and so on. It was a notable record. But come the end of the first, I guess it's decade and a half of the 20th century, there was World War I. We will be approaching very soon the centennial of our entry into the war, and it will be interesting to see how that is celebrated in Minnesota. War, as it always does, offered an excuse for repression. Persecution of German Americans and bread baiting were worse in Minnesota during World War I than in most of the country. And the situation created new alliances and shared anger. An organization was created called the Commission of Public Safety. Safety, you were in danger. We had to protect you. And there was mob violence. Union organizers for radical farm organizations were driven out, barred from towns, or driven out on tarred and feathered and driven out on rails. It was an ugly time. There was civil liberties almost did not exist in Minnesota. One can imagine that the reaction was strong, and the result was the Farmer Labor Party, which gathered steam in the 1920s and governed Minnesota during most of the 1930s depression. Again, historians are beginning to explain this partly because of the fact that the repression of World War I drew a lot of people who were normally very conservative, particularly the German American communities of central Minnesota that had always been very conservative, were so angered and upset by this that they rejected both of the major parties whom they held responsible and voted for the Farmer Labor Party. The 1930s, years of the Great Depression, saw protests on the streets and at the state capitol, the threat of mobs and farm foreclosures, and the nation's first sit-down strike, when packing house workers in Boston occupied the Hormel plant and refused to leave. I think how that strike played out is an example of how Minnesota managed to weather those rough years of the Depression. With the Farmer Labor Party not in complete control of the state by any means. They never controlled both houses of the legislature. They never controlled most of the elected state offices, but they did have the governor's office. And the governor was a widely popular man. I'm sure most of you have heard of him, Floyd B. Olson. Olson himself had been county prosecutor in Hamilton County, had made himself a reputation for supporting clean government. He was personally, he was no angel. It's been widely, pretty well proven he was an alcoholic, but he was a great governor. And I think many of the state's historians would say he was the state's greatest governor, given the difficulty of the times he held office through. He had a real genius for bringing people together to work out problems and to reach a compromise. And as I say, he was widely popular, far beyond the ranks of the Farmer Labor Party, in fact. There was an organization called the Minnesotans, I've forgotten exactly the name of it, all-party organization to elect Floyd Olson. It was led by Gene Whittick, who had been one of the leading Republicans in the state. In any case, the way he handled the strike in Austin is instructive. With the workers occupying the Hormel plant, the sheriff of the county immediately contacted the governor and said, we need to have the National Guard to take these people out of here. They are occupying private property. Olson did not send the troops. He got into his car and drove to Austin and met with both the company representatives and the Wobblies. They were mostly ex-IWW men, the organizers of the union, and achieved a compromise with no violence. The strikers decided not to turn off the refrigeration system in the plant, which would have resulted, of course, in a lot of property damage. They preserved the plant and preserved what was in it, and agreed to leave if their union was recognized, and they got a modest pay increase. And the company saw the light and decided that was the wise course to take. So that's the way Floyd Olson handled that, and as I say, it's a good example of the kind of skills he had. Another reason for the lack of violence in Minnesota during those stressful years of the Great Depression was the leadership of the farm holiday movement. The national leader of that movement was Milo Reno from Iowa. In Iowa, unfortunately, there was a great deal of mob violence associated with the farm holiday movement. In Minnesota, there was almost none. Some was threatened, but the leader in Minnesota was a Canby, Ohio County farmer named John Bush. Now, I understand that his descendants pronounce that Bush, but I met him, and my recollection is that he pronounced it Bosch. The best story I've heard about him is that when he was 3 years old, a visitor to the farm said, and what is your name, my little man? He stood up to his full 3-year-old height and said, I'm a populist. He had also, in the course of a rather sketchy education, I don't believe he actually finished high school, but he had read a lot about and by Mohandas Gandhi, and had become a great admirer of Gandhi's nonviolent civil disobedience. So he applied those lessons to the farm holiday movement in Minnesota, and with the willingness to compromise and the calming influence of a farmer Labor Party governor, they were able to get through it without a lot of violence. The main exception in those years was the trucker strike in 1934. We've all heard about that. That was when the power of the Citizens Alliance was broken. The battle on the streets of Minneapolis played a major role in tipping the whole country toward such landmark legislation as the National Labor Relations Act and the Social Security Act, both passed in 1935, the year after the trucker strike. Unemployment insurance was also adopted at about the same time. But one thing that was not achieved, as we know all too well today, was the National Health Care Act. It was proposed, but it didn't get through. The story of how that evolved, I can't get into in great detail, but briefly, since there was no national health insurance, as we moved into World War II, health insurance was used by employers as a way of recruiting workers in a labor shortage. They were prevented from raising wages by a cap on wages to avoid wartime inflation. But there was nothing said it was perfectly legal to offer benefits, fringe benefits, and one of the most popular was health care. And that is how, in this country, health care came to be locked in and associated with employment, which it has not been in most other countries. After the war, both the unions and the employers liked the system and continued it. There were efforts to get a national health care system, because obviously not everybody had an employer to pay their health care. In, I believe it was the later 1960s, I can't recall the exact year, maybe some of you do, the elderly population that was most in need of coverage was covered by the passage of Medicare, as we know, pretty much as we know it today. The result was the rather mixed and chaotic system that we have now. I can't go any farther with that, but if you want to know more about it, just ask the COAC folks. They have literature out there and a lot of know-how about it. In fact, that is how I met Don Pilkinen from COAC, working on that issue. Well, the threatening clouds of yet another war toward the end of the 1930s overshadowed state politics and brought back a lot of bitter memories. The death of Floyd Olson, he died quite young of cancer while he was still in office, brought division to his party and polarization to the state. In 1944, before the end of World War II, the combination of forces led to the merging of the farmer, labor, and democratic parties in Minnesota. Like the state's powerful populist movement in the 1890s, the farmer-labor coalition was swallowed whole in the national two-party maelstrom. But then, as before, the Minnesota Democratic Party was never quite the same again. And this time, even its name was changed. So, thus we have a DFL, another Democratic Party. At first, the remnants of the protest movement united around Henry Wallace, but they faced an already powerful military-industrial complex coming out of the war. And that complex was bent on world domination. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced the containment of communism as a national goal. And Minnesota's new generation of democratic leadership embodied in Hubert Horatio Humphrey, went along. Most of us in this room, I suspect, remember all or part of at least the 40 years of Cold War and the slowly building waves of new protests that accompanied it. Anti-nuclear testing, the Vietnam War, civil rights, Native American rights, women's rights, saving the environment. Minnesotans took part in all of them and were leaders in many. In 1984, St. Paul was the birthplace of the National Green Party at a conference held at McAllister College. The remnants of farm protests died beneath the steel towers that carried power from the coal-fired plants of North Dakota to the cities of Minneapolis and Chicago. Often wonder if that protest will be reborn and block the oil plants. One of the most moving things about history, I think, is listening to voices from the past and recognizing that in the words of the Czech writer Milan Kundera, quote, "The struggle of mankind against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." It's my hope that this little book will help to reawaken memories. And right now I would like to let you listen to some of the voices that I have used in the book. First, here's Ignatius Donnelly speaking at the National Convention of the Populist Party.